Is anyone not ready? Adam and I proudly affirm today's resolution that the United States federal government should accept at least 100,000 UNHCR-designated refugees per year. We define this to be a policy round as applied by the word should in the resolution, thus the weighing mechanism for this round should be net benefits. First, a little bit of background. The first argument is that since 1980, 3 million refugees have been settled in the United States. The second argument is that in 2017, 110,000 refugees was a target number to be set for refugees settled in the United States, but in 2018, that number has been cut almost in half to $50,000. It's according to the Pew Research Center. The third argument is that historically the United States has accepted an average of 112,000, give or take a little bit, every single year. So that's the plan. Plan is that the United States federal government will increase the cap on UNHCR refugees from $50,000 to $112,000 people annually. Once again, the United States federal government will increase the cap on UNHCR refugees from 50,000 people to 112,000 people annually. So that'll take place from 2019 and onwards because the target for this year has been set, and they'll be resettled and admitted through normal ways and means. Are there any questions about any of that? All right. 2 advantages, the first of which is death bad. In the status quo, refugees are overwhelmingly come from war-torn areas. In 2016, most of the United States refugees that were resettled came from places like Congo, Syria, Burma, Myanmar, and Iraq. These places have been struggling with civil wars or external wars for a really long time with multiple actors, and there's no signs of them stopping. The second argument is that, wars aren't ending. According to the Pew Research Center, the world is becoming increasingly more violent at an increasingly rapid rate, which means that the rate at which you're seeing civil conflicts and just general conflicts, A, go for longer, and B, arise is increasing, which means that the number of refugees that we're going to be seeing is probably going to increase in the future as civilians get caught in war-torn areas. The second argument is that you can look specifically at Syria, where conflict is expected to continue long into the future. The warrant for this is that any rebel progress that was made against Assad in the East Ghouta region was quashed because Assad just basically destroyed their base over there, which means that there is a significant setback in the Syrian conflict. Additionally, Israeli-Syrian tensions are increasing in the status quo on the south border, which is problematic because that creates flashpoint, which creates individualized conflicts between Israeli police and Syrian people. The third argument is that Turks and Kurds are fighting a lot in the north. This is especially problematic conflict because the Kurdish people are a religious minority. They're Christians in a predominantly Muslim area, which means that they're persecuted very strongly for their faith. The third argument under the uniqueness is that these people will just die if they don't escape their countries. You can look to the fact that they recognize this themselves, where people undertake really perilous journeys to get into areas like Greece or Germany or Turkey, where they believe that they will be able to escape the conflict and they'll be able to live a better, safer life. So people are willing to go to any means necessary, basically, to get out of these countries. And whether or not they are admitted is it's really important. These people either have a choice where they're able, undertake these journeys, or they will try to be settled in the United States. So how do we solve these harms? The first argument is that because these people will inevitably try to escape, it's best for us as policymakers to make sure that it is in the safest and most effective way possible, which is through resettlement. You can cross-apply the analysis where people will undertake the journey no matter what, so it's best that we admit people into the United States. The second argument is that this will be saving and improving people's lives because the quality of life in the United States is broadly better than in many of these countries where refugees will be coming in from, which means that they will have quality of life, the ability to have a successful family, the ability to establish a business, the ability to have quality of life is much higher in the United States. Second argument is that your probability of dying is just simply much lower in the United States than in any other country due to the lower crime rates. In fact, there's not wars going on and things like that. That's the impacts. The first impact is lives. So the chance of dying is very high in these countries, and because death is an infinite impact, because it's irreversible, because it short circuits any other things that you possibly can feel, and you can't have any value to life if you're dead, obviously. It's an infinite impact, which means that anything times infinity is also infinity itself. So even if there's a small probability of them dying, the infinite magnitude of death is reduced in the United States, where their probability of dying is also significantly lower, which means that you're saving 112,000 lives every year. Advantage 2 is culture and diffusion. in the status quo, there's a legacy of segregation, which means that a lot of urban neighborhoods are ethnically homogenous. You can look to the example of the fact that there are like literally areas of like San Francisco where we're from that are like Chinatown, Little Italy, and like other ethnic enclaves where people were settled when they came to the United States. The second argument is that racism stems from fear of the unknown, where people don't know what other people are like, and they apply these blanket generalizations to them in order to fear, because they haven't ever experienced like what it's like to actually know a person from Syria, what it's actually like to know a person from Iraq. So they come up with these assumptions about them that are really just inaccurate, and then those things don't change unless they actually, unless there's cultural diffusion that takes place. So the solvency. The first argument is that integration into institutions in the United States is going to lead to more cross-cultural exchange. This is really important because in the status quo, when we're decreasing the number of refugees that are admitted, these people from these countries oftentimes only are admitted through the refugee program. The standard means that the United States admits immigrants doesn't really apply to them because these people lack access to like the funding necessary to get lawyers to advocate on their behalf, or because they don't know the normal ways and means that people apply for citizenship to the United States or green card status or anything else, or like their living situations make it such that they aren't able to apply for different classes of visas. So basically these people, the only way that they're able to get into the United States is through refugee resettlement programs. The second argument is that academic and economic achievements will change media perceptions of immigrants and the way that they're presented in the like media cycle, where as you have more people from like these areas that are in positions of power that are visible on TV, in politics, in business, in health, the perceptions that exist around these like whole groups of people are just going to shift, because a lot of people view these people as like uneducated or unable to contribute anything to society because they do not view these people in powerful, important, influential roles, which is going to change when you increase the number of people. This is empirically confirmed by Irish and European Eastern immigrants who immigrated during the second like in the 20th century, whose success subverted the myth of racial hierarchy that existed previously to that. So that basically changed the entire way that like the United States like publicly present things with like racial hierarchies, because these people are in power. The impacts. The first impact is reduction of the military-industrial complex, because the military-industrial complex exports massive amounts of violence based on the perceptions of these people that like the people in the Middle East are violent and we need to go stop the violence over there. Those perceptions are what motivate the military-industrial complex from continuing, which is resolved under the affirmative use plan. The second argument is decreasing police brutality, because police brutality comes from a place of extreme racism, which is quelled through cultural diffusion and through like highlighting the fact that people aren't what the police make them out to be. Was that all good?
For speed?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
If you guys don't mind, can we take a minute of our prep to, or a minute of our speech to prep?
Yeah, I guess so. So hold on a second. So maybe not do this because I don't think it's gonna be super big problem. I guess we'll just go for like some of the stuff. Right,
How much time left?
7:16.
Thank you.
7:08.
Yeah, okay, that should be good.
Okay.
Okay, so,
You want to start at 7?
yeah, just start at 7.
Let's see. Hold it.
Okay. Quick order, first.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry, Andrew Fahey. For speaker communication.
How many off?
One off.
Okay. Is
And
it
then,
one?
first addressing advantages, both advantages in order, and then one off.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Sorry. 7 minutes on the clock. Time will be in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so starting first off with my opponent's A1 argument, which was essentially death by they cited tons of different wars, tons of different refugee sources, saying that there's essentially a problem. We have to be able to fix this problem by taking in refugees. We'd like to effectively say that actually, sorry, I want to adjust my order a little bit. I want to start with the dissad, because I just realized the approach with my disad is going to be used for the rest of the case. So sorry about order. Disad on top, then two advantages. Anyway, so first of all, with the disad, the disadvantage one is political backlash. So first of all, right now, within the fiscal year of 2017, according to the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United States accepted roughly 53,716 refugees with resettlement into the United States. With this in mind, we have to look to the fact that 112,000 is nearly double that amount. So then we have to ask, well, why did it get so low if my opponents say that in earlier years as high as 112,000? Well, as of right now, what we can see is that effectively with mass immigration crises around the world like these, we effectively end up seeing that there's a political backlash within the status quo. We look to, for uniqueness, we can look to the example of the European Union, where effectively we end up seeing many different countries adopting large anti-immigration parties, and essentially the birth of many alt-right movements that are effectively taking over governments in countries like Italy, Poland, the Netherlands, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. In all of these countries, large alt-right political parties are starting to take ground. Most notably in places like Italy and Germany, where essentially they are starting to work their way into the different governments and legislature to promote anti-immigration ideals. We already see a shift towards this within the status quo in the United States with the election of the Trump administration, in which upon the election, since he's been elected, we saw a 5% increase in hate crimes within the United States, rising up to 6,100 hate crimes per year. Ultimately, we end up seeing that there's also a large empowerment within the minority racist communities, where essentially we end up seeing a large backlash, and both politically and on the civil level of essentially racist ideologies within the status quo. So essentially what we end up seeing is that by nearly doubling the reason that this amount was cut down so low in the first place to 50,000 was in order to quell this. The last time it was this high, 112,000, was during the Obama administration, after which there was a radical change in government position. This radical change in government position can then be correlated to, like the rest of Europe, towards a want towards change and more towards conservative ideologies. With this in mind, what we can end up seeing is that a default back to liberal ideologies during a movement towards conservative ideologies only moves us closer towards conservative ideologies. So with this in mind, when we may set the cap on 112,000 112,000 refugees, we don't see that durable fiat can keep this in place as a cap for very long, simply because as it would essentially provoke these movements like similar legislature has in the past. We would ultimately end up seeing that this would result again once more in a decrease, probably more severe than the 50,000 because of this. What we have to weigh is the fact that that as long as we're helping 50,000 refugees now, if we start to double that number, we may become too ambitious and may not be able to help anyone. With this in mind, I want to essentially see how this applies to both of the advantages. So first of all, with the first advantage with that of death bad, we would like to essentially turn their impacts. Where essentially, while we do need to help these people, what would end up happening is as this political backlash grows and strengthens within the status quo, we would end up seeing that less and less refugees would be allowed in, and ultimately that 112,000 minimum that my opponent set would ultimately drop far lower than 50,000 refugees. So with this in mind, we would ultimately end up seeing that we are saving less lives in the long run, and because within this debate we also have to look about time frame as well as magnitude. If in the short term we are helping a lot of people, but in the long term we are helping significantly less people, then this isn't something that we can do, because as of right now, as my opponents brought up, there are already multiple war-torn countries across the world, and different areas that are producing many different refugee crises. Thus, there is no way that we can reasonably assume that these will be fixed within the long term. So we have to be looking at the long-term solvency, which is keeping it low now until we can allow for a natural shift instead of a forced shift during a conservative movement in the legislature. So with that in mind, we move into their A2, which is about cultural diffusion. We'd like to argue that in fact the exact opposite happens. Again, we refer to Europe, and instead of using an example from the 20th century, we instead use one from the 21st century. And in fact, happening within the status quo right now, where as of right now, refugees that are entering the European Union are essentially being segregated into essentially what ghettos, so to say, were essentially small little segregated communities of just these immigrants. Seeing that we have already seen this legislature, again comparing to Europe simply because the comparisons are fairly strong. What we would end up seeing is that as the status quo becomes more conservative, while the government stays liberal, we essentially end up seeing that the policy is then taken over by the civilians, in which immigrants are not only have racist acts and hate crimes committed against them, but we ultimately end up seeing that they are segregated and forced into ghettos and small communities that are essentially protective out of the outside world. Seeing that the number one cause of terrorism is in fact homegrown terrorism, in which somebody feels ostracized by their own community, in this case it would be immigrants, who could ultimately end up seeing that we would see an increase in domestic terrorism. However, the main impact here is that as of right now, the cultural diffusion would not occur, but instead we see cultural segregation as more and more people push for segregation within the status quo. You can't force something like cultural diffusion onto people simply because that is simply because if the people aren't ready to accept that cultural diffusion, the only thing you're going to be enforcing is a significant clash of cultures that results in a net detriment for the status quo. With this in mind, let's look directly into their impacts. One was about the military-industrial complex. We like to argue that this literally has no relations in terms of perception. As of right now, the military-industrial complex is primarily motivated by other factors, namely oil, where essentially they attack other countries and promote securitization for these regions, not based on the oppression of immigrants, but rather because they see a strategic advantage in harnessing these locations. So for all of those reasons, I urge a strong vote for the negation. Thank you.
Okay. Order is just going to be the Atherton order. Negation order.
You want to stand?
Yeah. Okay. Everybody good? Okay. First on top of case, extend our first observation that since 1980, 3 million refugees have been settled in the U.S., which means that if their backlash arguments are going to happen, those would have already happened in the status quo. It proves that their arguments about backlash and response are either A, empirically denied because they haven't happened, or B, they're already non-unique, because that would cause that to happen. Second, the fact that there's already 50K people being in status quo means that would also probably trigger the impact, right? They give no argument as to why it's a linear impact, right? It seems that if we're accepting large quantities of refugees versus even larger quantities of refugees, that would lead to the same increase in the alt-right. It's not like they calculate for every individual person that's coming here. Rather, they are against the notion of immigrants broadly in general, which probably means that there's very little uniqueness in the dishad. These two arguments are conceded. Next to the first advantage, go to the uniqueness. First of all, the argument that there is a ton of violence in many different countries in the status quo where people are at risk of dying every day. There are thousands of people dying that the plan directly prevents, because people are not going to be killed by violence in the United States. This outweighs the disadvantage on magnitude, because hate crimes are mostly non-fatal. Also, it outweighs on probability, since hate crimes are affecting a smaller percentage of the people that come here than people than the status quo, than in the status quo, where they face an everyday risk of dying or violence. Second, after the near analysis about the Turkish-Kurdish conflict also outweighs on magnitude, because it prevents that these hate crimes are inevitable. In other words, that racial violence and racial tension between different ethnic groups is probably worse in other countries where there's less rule of law, there's more militarism, there's more easy access to weapons, which means the hate crimes in like places like Iraq and Syria are probably A, much more often, but B, much more violent in the first place. So these hate crimes are probably going to be a lot less severe in the United States, which means that outweighs on magnitude. Next. Oh yeah, they've also conceded that there's a triad after these refugee groups, because they will literally die right now in the status quo. Next on to the on the solvency arguments. First of all, the argument that there's simply a lower probability of death in the United States because there is a lower, that's just an empirical fact. Second, their quality of life is a lot better because the U.S. actually has access to resources like basic healthcare that people in these countries aren't getting, which means that even if they don't die, they're suffering immense amounts of pain and other physical issues, which is probably a massive impact on their net benefits for America. And then also extend the impact under the argument under solvency that fleeing to other countries is inevitable, right? Which means that people in these countries will be moving to places in Europe already in the status quo. They'll just be doing it in really unsafe ways, which means that A, the hate crime impacts of the dishad are triggered no matter what, and B, it means that there's a unique net benefit to the affirmative, which is that they're not going across the Mediterranean on boats that sink all the time and kill hundreds of people every couple of weeks. Rather, they're coming on planes that the U.S. government is actually paying for, or coming in a safe way, which is another net benefit to the affirmative over the dishad. Next on the second advantage. we are not going for the impact level on this disadvantage, rather we're going to see a link turn to the disadvantage. The argument is really simple. It's that more people coming to the U.S. will lead to a deconstruction of dominant narratives that black and brown people are inherently violent or unproductive. The argument is that people in immigrant communities tend to start up a lot more businesses because they need to, right, in order to survive. Empirically, it's confirmed that immigrants start up businesses at 4 times the rate of American citizens. Second, the other argument is that immigrants are much less likely to commit violence because they have very strong incentive to not be deported or not go to jail and actually protect their families because they really don't want that to happen because they just fled that form of violence. The argument is that once people see that these people that immigrants are not committing crimes in the U.S. and are actually starting businesses that are employing a lot of people, this will lead to a deconstruction of those narratives because people will see that these immigrants are not dangerous but are actually very productive, helpful members of American society. They say that this will lead to segregation again as well. First of all, one, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that people are going to be segregated into communities that are small homogenous groups and say that hate crimes will increase because in these small homogenous groups, people will probably resist more against hate crimes and be in a neighborhood where they are protected because they feel like they're surrounded by people like them and are actually not going to be forced into situations where they're constantly minorities. But second, you say that the terrorism rate increase. No, we say this is empirically denied because they're American citizens commit acts of terrorism at a much higher rate than immigrants in the first place. Also, the other arguments will prove that these perceptions will also be subverted. Yeah.
If American citizens commit acts of terrorism at a much higher rate, doesn't that just further our argument about the implications of homegrown terrorism and a lack of fitting into society?
No, the argument is that most terrorists are white men, right? Mm-hmm. And so when people see that the people committing acts of terrorism are disproportionately not immigrants, they'll recognize that those people are not dangerous and do not need to be there's no need to commit acts of violence against them, right? Also, we show this is empirically confirmed by the integration of Irish and Eastern European people. It's subverted the racial hierarchy, which used to hold Irish and Eastern European people at the bottom or near the bottom of American society. But as a result of their economic success and integration institutions, that led to an increase in their prosperity and led to a decrease in those perceptions in the first place. Next, on the dissent proper. First of all, in dissent, it's terminally non-unique because there's already a ton of anti-immigrant sentiment in the status quo, right? The alt-right is somewhat mainstream, have a lot of appeal, but there's no reason why they're going to be more upset by 100,000 people than 50,000 people. The fundamental reason why this movement exists is because they're racist and they feel marginalized and disillusioned. Those impacts don't get any worse when you just bring more people, right? There's no analysis why a doubling in the number of people will lead to a doubling in the amount of that sentiment in the first place. Second, it's also non-unique because Trump is a massive alt cause. The dissent, the fact that their increase in hate crime is only based on Trump's political violence at things like rallies, and evidence suggests that political violence increases when a Trump rally comes to a particular town. That's not linked to the actual increase in that's just an increase in number of hate crimes, but it's not saying that that's actually attributed to a decrease in immigration. Second, the fact that immigration decreased and hate crimes also increased probably proves that if anything, the link scenario is wrong, and that the link scenario is wrong, and if anything, goes backwards. Next, on the they say that the increase happened with Obama, but one no link. Obama's popularity proved that this is probably not something that mainstream Americans are very against. Second, this is actually an extremely popular proposal because Americans felt like they had a moral obligation to welcome people from places like Syria into the country. The second link to, and this is much worse than in Europe. When people are just getting on boats to Europe, it's a lot more dangerous because they're on boats that are really unstable. That was in the 1EC, and it was earlier on case. But second, it's also worse because these parties in Europe gain a lot more traction because Europe is a multi-party system where small alt-right parties can gain a larger fraction of the representation in parliaments. But in the U.S., it's different because it's a two-party system, in which case there are still moderate voices in the Republican Party that temper down some of those issues, which means that the political backlash is probably likely to be less substantial. Yes?
When has the moderate temperance worked?
I mean, right now to some extent, right? The fact that the alt-right hasn't carried away the entire party, there are definitely people that oppose Trump in the party that have had voices that have influenced policy on numerous occasions. It's probably a lot worse in Europe. Next, on the fiat arguments about rollback. We should get access to durable fiat, which means that we get to defend the plan happens consistently and doesn't get rolled back. Two reasons. First is ground. If we just say that the plan gets rolled back, that prevents us from stably constructing ground because it means that our entire debate focused around these hypothetical implements. Moving targets kill ground because they prevent the effective construction of disheads and links to the affirmative in the first place. This is probably terrible if we allow them to get these rollback arguments. Second, topical clash. We just defend that the affirmative policy is rollback. Then it's a question of political act, the feasibility of political action, which is never what debates are about. Debates are about whether or not not we think this is a good policy, right? That leads to a discussion that's incredibly speculative, incredibly difficult to jump into, and it skirts the core of topical clash. Fairness and education are voting issues because fairness is the only way you can evaluate debates because it determines like who did better debating rather than who did better cheating. And education is a voting issue because in the long term, if we get a debate, the argument is just drop the argument. Second, no reason why we should expect a decrease below 50K, right? Like why would we expect it to go back below the baseline that it is at now? There's no analysis of this argument done at all. Third, it's also highly speculative. They don't give any warrants for why this would happen. This would happen in status quo. Also, fourth, this argument is ridiculous, right? The fact that we're even having a debate about this in the first place means that, like, obviously, like, this is not going to happen under the Trump administration, right? The whole point of this topic is that we get to debate about what would hypothetically happen or what we think government policy should be, which means that having a debate about whether or not this gets rolled back or whether or not this policy is probabilistically likely to come into action kind of misses the point. Anything else? Yeah, okay. Also, yeah.
We should have asked. Do you guys want the stand?
I don't know.
No.
Cool. Actually, I'll take the first minute of my speech for prep.
Okay.
Just go for whatever. Just do it right away.
So, that's 7:17.
Yep.
So order, I'll be going over the fiat arguments, and then over our A2, and then the A1, and then our dissent. So basically like the order.
So like fiat, second advantage, first advantage, dissent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Starting time now. So let's start with the fiat. So basically, judges, so first on their first standard of ground. So basically, how are we supposed to argue that refugees are bad? There's no room for the neg to argue that we shouldn't be accepting people if they're going to be killed. Like there's no like ground for that. And so unless you expect us to advocate for a position where we are going to basically just be killing people, I don't think there's any ground in this debate. We need to be able to not have this fiat not be durable, because if they could just say that this fiat is durable for infinity, they could accept a bad policy that will just and even if it would be repealed in the future, then we can they would just be able to say no, it would solve for all those problems that would cause that backlash into infinity. And so we need to be able to reduce this durable fiat, because we need to be able to have some ground and have some way of arguing that this specific policy would actually be worse because it would harm people in the future. That sort of cross applies to their topical clash, because the neg has no ground on basically just killing people. And so so basically that links both into fairness and education. Like if the neg teams are constantly forced to advocate for a side that directly links to killing people and directly links to basically just destroying lives, how are we supposed to actually have educational debates? We should be having debates about what's important, like what actually is the best way to achieve something, not whether or not accepting people from a place where they're gonna get shot is actually like good or not, right? Like it's simple as that. We need ground, and this is how we achieve ground in this round. And there's plenty of conflict. They had plenty of arguments against our point anyway. So I think there's plenty of ground, and you need to allow for neg ground in this round. All right, so moving on to the A2 culture. So my opponents seem to think that by accepting refugees, putting them into small communities, and then allowing the alt-right to continue to exist and as in the status quo, that things are magically going to get better just because people are in the country. That's not true. We can look to Europe, we can see that just when you have these immigrants in these small communities, what actually ends up happening is that people become more racist, become more, because they're not actually integrated. They're in these small ghettos. And so when they say integration, they concede the fact that these refugees would go into small communities, and these small communities actually create more racism, more hate crimes, because when someone comes in from when they look from the outside to these poor communities, they see that they keep their racist beliefs because they're not living with them. That's what integration means. And we can see this happening in the status quo in Europe. Specifically in France, we can see that the Paris attack was a direct result of the poor integration of Muslim refugees in Paris. And so basically turn their entire culture point, because all these refugees are just going to be focused in the small ghettos, and it's only going to make things worse.
It's also worth noting that their argument about white terrorism is entirely supportive of our case, because our argument is that people that are ostracized in society create terrorism. So therefore, if we ostracize more of these immigrants, we would ultimately create terrorism.
Right. So basically, their white terrorism supports our argument, because when you ostracize people, you create more terrorism, and either from the outside or from the inside, because people feel like isolated and they want to backlash against the government. And so turn their culture point, it's just not true. And so then we basically get into their A1. So what we're saying is that what's going to happen is that when you advocate for this increase in a conservative and alt-right political climate that we have now, because we can see with President Trump, we can see like Steve Bannon and all these people are gaining control in politics. And what happens is that when what we see is that maybe it's implemented faithfully for 5 years, but what happens is the alt-right and the right wing becomes so heated over the fact that we doubled the amount of refugees. It doesn't necessarily have to be particularly significant. It just has to be enough for propaganda to take over. It has to be enough for propaganda to be furious about how many refugees we're accepting. And so what's going to happen is that maybe 5 years down the line, when the plan's been faithfully implemented, it's going to be repealed, and ultimately we're only going to create we're only going to help less people in the long run, because we're only going to be able to accept that limited number of refugees at the end of the day. And so basically, we actually get gain access to their impacts, because over the long term, they're only linking into their own impacts more by creating a system where we have these refugees and they're just being rejected because the plan has been completely cut down, because these alt-right reactionary forces are completely against it and are in control of the government. And so what you're voting on, Judge, is the fact that they're okay, so so basically they said, oh no, this has been empirically denied, and they didn't exactly say why, but what we can see is that this backlash is already happening in the status quo. We have empirical evidence that it is. Hate crime went up when Trump was elected. Simple as that. It's not about whether or not Trump was elected. It's about the fact that because he was elected, the racist minority that exists within the United States has become more empowered and feels like they have more legitimacy, and therefore they commit more hate crimes because they feel legitimized by the government. And so when we don't want to bring refugees into this situation, because we're going to see more hate crimes, because people are going to buy into the alt-right propaganda that's definitely going to happen, and then they're going to only make things worse, and only going to make this fiat policy, or this policy, completely fall apart. And so they say, it's worse in other countries, but that is outweighed by the fact that if this policy falls apart, then what's going to happen is that people are just going to die more, and also we don't want to make things worse in the United States. We want to make sure that we save that we prevent as many people as possible from experiencing these hate crimes. It would only make things worse in the United States by raising the cap on refugees. And so basically we're winning in this round because we've turned their culture point. We've said that them accepting refugees is only going to make things worse in the long run, and we've won the political backlash to that because it's empirically happening in the status quo. Thank you.
Okay, 4 minutes on the clock. I will be doing small overviews of all the cards in order. It would be first advantage, second advantage, disad. From there, I'll be doing an overview of the case, as well as some slight impact calculus. So with 4 minutes on the clock, we will begin time now. starting first off on the advantage provided by my opponents with that about death being bad. Well, as we've said and as my opponents have fairly failed to counter, we look to the fact that that in the long run we would ultimately end up seeing an overall decrease, especially since we should be valuing the long-term implications of the policy rather than the short term. My opponents extend the fact that as of right now we are looking at the long term, not the short term, seeing that my opponents didn't counter that. So with that in mind, let's look into their only real counter for this was that it wasn't well justified. With this, I would like to counter this by saying that it is justified because it's currently what's happening within the status quo. My opponents say that if what we're saying is really true, then we would be seeing it in the status quo. And our argument is we are seeing it in the status quo. That's what all the arguments about Europe are. We are seeing in the status quo as of right now. Europe is ostracizing these people. As of right now in the status quo, Europe is increasing the rate of homegrown terrorism by ostracizing immigrant groups as they enter the country. We are seeing as of right now in the status quo, Europe is moving towards an alt-right stance due to the fact that there's a large increase. They are moving towards an alt-right stance, and the increase in immigrants is only fueling that alt-right stance. So with that in mind, we look to the fact that as of right now, the United States is also taking a conservative stance, and thus it's only likely that as we increase more immigrants and in fact double it in the next year, we would effectively end up seeing a large enough political backlash in order to fuel this. With this in mind, we look to the fact that with this in mind, we look to the never mind. Anyway, moving on to what their A2 was on culture. Judge, we clearly win this round simply because there is no actual evidence to support that cultural diffusion can happen in the modern age. We look to the fact that as of right now in the status quo, in both America and Europe, different immigrant communities are ostracized by race and forced into smaller communities, and this is in fact homegrown terrorism. Moving to their argument about white terrorism, we look to the fact that as of right now, the main cause of white terrorism is white people not feeling comfortable with their current society, which is in fact a result of things like these immigration policies. So we'd ultimately end up seeing an increase of that. So thus we turn to white terrorism point. With this, we also look to the fact that they said that we can't have segregation both ways because we can't have hate crimes and also have them in communities, but Judge, this is simply not true. Just because they live in communities doesn't mean they're immune to hate crimes. Anyway, moving on to our dissent, you can essentially apply the similar analysis for both the A1 and the A2, seeing that our dissent was effectively acting as a turn for these for both the A1 and the A2. On the argument about durable fiat, we look to the fact that as of right now, while the affirmation does have durable fiat to an extent, we look to the fact that they aren't allowed to fiat everything for the majority of eternity. What we have to say is that eventually policies do fall, and policies do fall by political backlash. If you ultimately remove ground from the negation by removing an entire facet of political backlash, you can ultimately destroy entire topics. Where topics like this, instead of taking an anti-immigrant stance, we instead take the stance that taking in too many immigrants is bad. And so to effectively mitigate to effectively create a more moral standpoint for the nation, because let's be real, nobody would think it's a good debate if we just got up here and said immigrants were bad. Like, that would be over within the first speech. Anyway, with that in mind, we look to the fact that durable fiat is the only way for the neg to have for non-durable fiat in this scenario is the only way for the neg to have ground, so we let that flow through. Lastly, let's move into a little bit of impact calculus. Judge, you should be valuing the dehumanization that would occur upon this as well, over the lives that my opponents say, because the dehumanization encourages racial oppression within a system, and while people die, we ultimately end up seeing that more people die because of dehumanization and oppressive systems. More people would die because of dehumanization and oppressive systems. So in order to discourage this dehumanization, allow for the conservative movement to pass before raising this, we would just strong vote for the negation side. Thank you.
Those there's more race and violence in top.
Order is going to be advantage 2, culture on top, followed by an overview, advantage 1, followed by, so I flowed the durable fiat debate on the disadvantage, so wherever you flowed that, that's going to be after the overview, followed by death bad, followed by political backlash. I need that.
Yeah.
Okay, is anyone not ready? On advantage 2, Adam never extends the impact, so we're conceding the impact decent on no perception for the military-industrial complex, and I've looked up police brutality. There's no offense off disadvantage. We read it as a link turn to their advantage, but the turn that they read on disadvantage and their disadvantage are functionally the same thing, which means that there's no external offense on this advantage for you to be voting on. Go to the overview. This debate basically boils down to plan versus status quo. In the status quo, they're admitting 50,000 people no matter what. This question is, and they never read you any specific evidence that said in the future that number is going to go below 50,000 even if you pass a plan. Which means even in a world where you buy the durable fiat doesn't exist and the plan gets rolled back, for 2019 that means you have 110,000 people, and in 2020 you might go back to 50,000. So that's 50,000 extra people that you'll be admitting to the United States. They never say that it's going to go down to 20,000 or it's going to go down to 10,000 or it's going to get any worse than the status quo. Which means that when you're evaluating plan versus status quo, we just get flat out more people from that in terms of number of people that we're saving lives. Secondly, people are going to be leaving these war-torn regions inevitably, and it's a question of whether they're going to Europe through these like really horrible ways, like where they die on boats or they get like raped or killed by smugglers, or their quality of life is just overall worse because they're packed in really unsanitary conditions, or they don't have access to like lighting or clean water or these things, or if they get resettled to the United States, which has infrastructure to support them. The third argument is that they basically impact out to dehumanization, we impact out to death. Death over dehumanization for two primary reasons. The first argument is death is the root of all evil in the world, because death short circuits any future impacts, which means that if you are dead, you can't experience anything else, which means that there's no way that you are able to escape that. The second argument is that death is irreversible. So when you're dead, you can't come back to life. Science hasn't got that far yet, but if you've been dehumanized, you can be rehumanized, which means that if you're able to like come into a society that you're integrated with, that there's a possibility that you're able to like live a better, more rehumanized life, which means that the differential in terms of impact, in terms of magnitude, is significantly in our favor. Go to T. Extend the fact that we durably fiat the argument that they made is that there's no reason that we can then prove that refugees are bad. You don't need to prove that refugees are bad. You can talk about implementational things through proposing counterplans. You restrict refugees from one specific area that you isolate a region from through a plan inclusive counterplan. There's K's, there's T. The negative has a whole score of different strategies that they're able to negate through that aren't necessarily just saying that the app is wrong. Secondly, you don't even need to advocate killing people through disadvantages. You could read like politics disadvantages that talk about midterms or like other types of things that don't necessarily interact with refugees specifically, but just like liberal policy as a whole. The arguments that you make, like the arguments that you chose to make, basically what I'm saying is that there's just like a variety of different options that you had in this specific one that you chose. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to access durable fiat in this debate.
Also extend moving target kills ground.
Yeah.
Because you don't know when it's going to roll back.
Also, you can extend Adam's second standard that moving target kills round. You can see this empirically proven in the round on the first advantage. You don't need to go there right now, but I'm just pointing this out, where they talk about repeal and how the repeal might be happening in 5 years. And this argument basically is like why no durable fiat is a really like ridiculous argument to be making, because now if I want to respond to this, I need to be predicting what the United States political climate is going to be looking like in 5 years in the future, which means I need to like guess about whether Democrats or Republicans are going to be in power, or like what the Congress or the Senate looks like, or like what people's attitudes towards refugees are, which means that the debate just gets really speculative and really uninteresting. So we should do durable fiat. Advantage 1 proper. We say that these refugees are overwhelmingly from war-torn areas. That's our first uniquest point, and our third uniquest point is that these people will die if they do not escape, and that they are going to be escaping no matter what. The way in which they escape is the question of this debate. Whether we think that the way that they escape is like through these really dangerous, problematic ways, or if they come to the United States. The only options that they have is dehumanization, but in a world where we have significant, we're way ahead in why you should be weighing death over dehumanization. That was my overview. It's just pretty clear cut in that regard. Additionally, our plan directly refutes because we pull people out of war-torn areas. That's something that actually happens tangibly. The rest of the advantage, there just wasn't a ton of ink anywhere on here. So it's like a pretty, it's like a pretty easy thing.
Oh, make sure you just do like hate crimes, like the hate crime.
You can extend Adam's argument that hate crimes typically aren't fatal, whereas getting shot in like friendly fire or crossfire is. That like hate crimes typically like hate crimes that are occurring are typically on a smaller magnitude, based in terms of just numbers that occur. Just in terms of magnitude, is probably preferable to be in the United States, where you're not at risk of just like getting shot or like your house bombed or things like that. On political backlash, extend the fact that Obama was popular and people liked him, and response. So they read 3 links to this disadvantage. One is the last time it was in Obama's area. The second is conservative pushback, and the third is that that the plan isn't durable. The plan is durable, prove that. With regards to Obama, Obama was popular and people really liked him, and you didn't see any backlash against Obama from the result of this. Doesn't mean that there's not going to happen now. Conservative pushback, we say that the European multipolarity system allows for that, because multipolarity allows that you're allowed to foster extremist ideals in its own condensed political party. There's no check back, like in the two-party system in the United States where you have moderates Republicans that are checking back.